Yeah, look, as Michael said, it's a very informal presentation, so if you've got questions on the way through, feel free to interrupt, ask questions as we go. I'd like to make sure everyone gets as much as possible out of the presentation. Succession planning for me is really a couple of key things, but ultimately it's about a strategic approach to exiting your business. What we see and witness a lot with clients is a lot of time and effort going into the entry, so working out cash flow, working out who they need to employ, where do I set up my office, all that sort of stuff. Very little time going into the exit. In terms of professional investors, so private equity firms, venture capital firms, all their focus is on the exit. All they think about is how do I get out. If we take deals to a private venture capital firm, private equity guys, they always want to know what's the exit. That's the first question they ask. So really important to get the strategic focus right in terms of the exit. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some basic information. So we start with some basic statistics just to have a look at the background of why this is an important issue. This one's fairly important, and the key word is the primary issue. 51% of business owners using their business as the primary source to fund their retirement. And that's obviously a concern when there's that many people involved. And the primary source is really the key point there that we need to look and work out how we're going to manage that. 43% are looking for a lump sum, and about a third expect some kind of ongoing revenue stream, some sort of ongoing income from the business. Average age of a business owner is now 56 years. That's always increasing. Aging population, baby boomers, all that sort of stuff, that's fairly constantly increasing, that statistic. 55% of all firms are planning to recruit. Now that's interesting from a succession planning point of view. What it means is the competition for talent will not ease. It's going to get tighter and tighter. We've already got quite low unemployment at the moment, so if anything, that's going to get harder, not easier. This one's also interesting. 61% of business owners right now, this is a survey done in the last 3 months, would consider selling if they were approached. So it's nearly, not quite 2/3, but it's a lot of business owners out there that would think about selling if someone approached them now. And that is probably, the reason that's in red is it's fairly scary. 31% do not have any kind of documented, funded retirement plan. They're sort of a bit vague about what they actually need, how much, where it's going to come from, how they're going to get it, etc. So, why succession planning? This is probably the most important statistic, and that is that in Australia at the moment, 55% of all business exits are some kind of failure. Now, death, that's obviously a pretty serious failure, but bankruptcy, liquidation, divorce, family estate planning, liquidation, or simply just closing the doors. So more than half of all business exits are some kind of failure, and that's obviously a fairly important issue. Also important issue, that we come back to that point about 43% aiming for a lump sum. The lump sum part's fairly important because it's difficult to get. And most business owners have this false expectation that they'll get to 65, advertise the business, sell it, walk away with a lump sum. And what we know from the statistics is that actually doesn't happen. So, the question we start with, and the reason we always start with this question is it's quite strategic, and my focus is always very strategic with clients, not so much detail around the financial accounting and tax issues. The question is, what do you want from your business in 5 or 10 years' time? And that's really about setting some goals. It's about working out strategically, what do you need to do? No right or wrong answer. It's really an individual selection or choice, but it's about finding out what that choice is. The important thing about that is probably the time frame. To start to think 5 or 10 years in advance, what do you want from your business? And we get all sorts of answers. I've had people say, I don't want to be here anymore in 5 or 10 years. I want to be fishing. I want to work 3 days a week. I want to rip a stack of cash out to invest in commercial property. Whatever it is, no right or wrong, as I said, but it's important that that goal is actually set. And importantly, after that, work out how we're going to actually achieve that, what we're going to do to get there. The way that we do that is a simple 4-stage strategy. And we start with simply identifying what we've got. So a little bit like going to a real estate agent to sell your house, the first thing they'll do is come out and do an appraisal. They'll look at your house, work out what it's worth, what are the problems with it, what are the things that might be worthwhile spending a bit of money on to fix up, clean up, paint, so you can add a bit of value. So that's where we start. What have we actually got to start with? Then we start to look at, well, how could we improve what we've got? What could we do to maximise that value? We work very closely with the guys in the financial services area because this comes back to funding the retirement. So business owners that say, well, we work it out, we need $3 million when we retire and our business is only worth 1.8, then there's a gap. Now, have we got that gap covered in other assets, or we've got property, or we've got other investments? If we haven't, well, we better work out how we make the business worth $3 million or whatever it is that we might need. So it's all part of that retirement planning. The next step is actually the point where most business owners start the process. Most people start at stage 3, which is the transaction, the sale or the equity or the listing or whatever the actual transaction is. Stage 3 is actually quite easy if you do the first 2 properly. If you don't and you just do stage 3, you'll lose a lot of money or risk losing a lot of money. The last one's also important after the transaction and during the transaction, in fact. How do we manage that wealth? So if we're going to extract wealth from a business, what structures are we going to use to hold it in? Do we use super? Do we use family trusts? How do we pass it on to the next generation? How do we protect it? How do we make sure we're covered in the case of an unplanned event, if someone gets sick, if someone gets hit by a bus? How is all that managed in the process? As I said, first stage is simply identify, work out what's actually there. It's all about value, so all these stages are about some kind of value. Stage 1 is about identifying the value. How we do that is a couple of things. The first one is simply evaluation. So the same as you get a valuation on a house or an appraisal from a real estate agent, we would go and value the business. What's it worth today? And what's driving that value? So what do we use to measure that value going forward as well as what it's worth today? The next thing we do is benchmarking. Has anyone had their business benchmarked before? No one? Really? Yeah, a couple of people? Useful?
Yes.
Yeah, really useful exercise to highlight the areas in the business where you can find under or over performance. So we simply measure your business performance against similar businesses, same industry, same area, same size, and we can then see quickly areas where the business is over or underperforming. That'll allow us to focus on those areas to improve the value. The next thing we do is what we call reverse due diligence. So in any purchase transaction, there's due diligence done by the buyer. A little bit like a pest and building inspection for a home. It is about finding the pests or the building problems, but it's more importantly about how do we actually identify issues that are going to cost us money. So if I'm going to buy your business, what are the risks? And we go through financials, we go through legal issues, documents, agreements. We try and find anything that's a risk, anything that's going to cause problems, because that's what a buyer will do. And a buyer typically will use it to reduce the price. They'll use it as a negotiation tool to reduce the price. So we want to find those things well before we get to a buyer, and if we can, fix them, update them, and I'll show you how we do it. The next thing we do is a structural review, and this is really simple, but very, very common that business owners that we meet don't have the most appropriate structure in place. Unfortunately, when you start a business, probably what you do is start cheap, quick and easy, and that probably means set up a $2 shelf company, mum and dad are the shareholders, mum and dad are the directors, and that stays like that. I've met clients recently that have got $20, $30 million businesses that are still like that. So at the time they set it up, it's probably appropriate, it's probably okay. As it grows into something quite substantial, it's no longer appropriate or okay, for a whole stack of reasons. The most important reason is asset protection, and what that's about is quarantining the risk from the assets. In all business, there's risk. There's no business on earth that hasn't got some element of risk. Some of it a lot more than others. You can't get rid of the risk, we can certainly minimise it, and some of the work that we do does minimise risk in areas of the business, but we can't get rid of it all, so what we've got to do is try and protect, quarantine if you like, the assets from the risk. We don't want them together. So we work with clients where they've purchased property in the trading entity, where we've got assets sitting inside the trading entity, and that's where all the risk is. We work to move those assets out, mainly for protection, often for tax effectiveness. There's sometimes more tax effective ways to own assets, but certainly the protection's a big issue, minimise the risk. The next thing is to look at a strategic planning approach. So start to look at what do we need to do for 2 things. What's the vision we've got? What are we actually trying to achieve? And that's that question we asked before about what do you want from your business in 5 or 10 years. More importantly, how are we actually going to get there? What are the things we need to do every month, quarter, year for the next 5 or 10 years to actually get to that point? And we've got a unique process as part of our work that actually identifies those, and then I'll show you how we map them out. The first part of that is a financial analysis. So we have a look at a business for a number of different categories, as you can see. In terms of financials, we do some analysis on 4 to 5 years financial statements and come back with a scorecard, if you like, a very simple analysis of all the financial metrics in the business. So you can see that's a real example. There's obviously no name on there, so no one knows who it is. But that's a real example of one of our clients. And we've identified with this client a couple of key things. We've got a profitability problem. So these red crosses are what we call nicely unfavourable results. Not good. So we've got a profitability problem. We've also got a debt to equity problem. It probably means they're carrying a lot of debt. They've got a lot of interest costs that's reduced their profitability. We've also got accounts receivable problem, which is very common these days in the current economic climate. But what we can do with that is actually use that to go and identify where we need to focus some attention. So obviously, strategically, if we're going to look at that business, we'd want to reduce some debt. We'd want to improve some profitability. Now, then we have to go away and work out what do we need to do that. And I'll talk about how we do that as well as we go. The next thing we do, which is equally important, whilst I've got an accounting background, it's very important to understand a lot of these things that drive business performance are not financial. So we look at, in every business, a whole stack of metrics, same sort of scorecard system. And you can see, interestingly, in this business, in the top right-hand corner under strategic and planning, there's a whole stack of crosses. So what that tells me is they don't have a business plan, they don't have a succession plan, they don't have values documented. There's a whole stack of things in that business that haven't been covered in terms of strategy and planning. So we've also got in a number of different areas on the left-hand side here, there's no buy-sell agreements and there's no shareholders agreements. So in this particular client, in any client, that's going to be a problem. In this one, it's a big problem because there's 5 shareholders. And there's no agreement between them as to how they operate, what the rules are, and certainly in terms of buy-sell, what happens if one of them gets hit by a bus, or gets very sick and can't work anymore, or etc. So this allows us to identify all those things, not necessarily financial, some of those are legal, some of them are operational, some of them are systems. So the remuneration system means they probably haven't got detailed performance appraisal system and feedback to staff about their performance. So that's a HR issue. So our role is really to identify what those key problems are, and then identify in terms of priority which ones are the most important to address in order, and then work through that process. So we work with this particular client. We'll be working with them for probably 18 to 24 months on each one of those stages. And during the period that we're working with them, the people working with them, there'll be a project manager involved. There may well be, or there will be in this case, obviously, guys from the financial services area. We'll get a lawyer involved because there's no shareholders agreements. There's some benchmarking to be done, and there's certainly a lot of strategic planning that needs to be done and documented in this business. So it's a fairly, yep.
So is this exactly what each one looks like, or do you sort of change the matrix depending on the type of company?
Yeah, good question. This is the core scorecard, but depending on the business, for real estate, for example, there's a number of different measurements we put in there. So depending on the industry and the background, we might change some of these. Okay. Or we might find, if we find that the top area is all green ticks, well, there's not much point measuring that. We know it's done. We'll measure some other areas within the business. There's about 53 of these metrics that we measure. Okay. So it comes from a detailed questionnaire that we go through with clients when we interview them. There's also a fact find, a little bit like a financial planning fact find. You know, what have they got, what do they own, what are their assets, what are their debts, which allows us to start to work out, well, actually we've got 5 shareholders here, we should have a shareholders agreement. That all goes together to basically come up with some ratings, but more importantly an action plan to work out what are the things that we need to fix. Some of those on there, as you saw, were fairly urgent. If someone got hit by a bus in that company, there'd be a significant problem. And hopefully that doesn't happen to anybody, but statistics tell us it does. So we need to address that. There are other things on there that probably weren't as terrifyingly urgent, but still needed to be addressed. So we need to work through those in order of priority.